All right. Thank you so much, Nancy. And glad to be here with everybody today. We've got a really good group. It looks like a pretty sizable group, which is nice in doing these virtual sessions. So appreciate everyone joining today to learn a little more about budgeting and how that can help with your sustainability. So I'm going to kick it off here. Everyone see my slides? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good deal. Okay, good deal. All right. So as Nancy said, I'm going to be building off of what she talked about with the goals and activities and your beginning thoughts on that, and then how those relate and feed into a budgeting plan. And so a little bit about me and where I come from, why I'm here is my name is Nate Snodgrass, and what I've done for a living for about the last 19 years or so, I've done financial analysis and budgeting in both industry and higher ed. And so I'd worked at General Electric Aviation in Cincinnati, Ohio, where they manufacture aircraft engines, and I've spent a great deal of time in higher ed as well at Purdue University in budgeting and finance kind of roles. Currently a project manager for the Hub Zero Science Gateway software platform, and that's currently located at the University of California, San Diego, and is pretty heavily engaged in the Science Gateways Community Institute. And then for life, what I like to do is spend time with my wife and 4 young kids, and I like smoked meats and craft beer and golfing. All right, into what we're going to talk about today. And so we're going to spend some time in hopefully helping you recognize the value of building an activity-based budget and focusing on those activities rather than, as Nancy mentioned, how many people you feel like you need in doing a budget. Rather focus on the activities and determining the type of work that needs to be done. It's very important when you do that to know what the full costs of those activities are. And also talk about some cost containment or management strategies that are related to some of those activities. And so I also wanted to do a quick poll for the group, if Claire could launch that, and kind of get an idea of where you're at with your project and the types of budget or funds that you're used to dealing with. Okay, looks like we've got an overwhelming response so far.
So I'd like to be able to select more than one of these. So.
Oh yeah, that would be nice. So what would the if you're selecting more than one, what would yours be?
So we're spending down the last little bit from a major grant. We also have some funding from other things, support from that, and we have other like major proposals that are in where we've done a lot of budgeting for that. So
okay, so
that's one of these to click for you. So
I would say choose the one that's your primary source of your funds or budget.
Well, we have very little right now, so that's right now the main support is, I guess, other on this.
Okay, that works. That works. So it looks like we've gotten most all the responses. So pretty overwhelming response on spending down grant funds per the original proposal. Had a couple that were sources of funds that are not from grants. So it might be institutional or gifts or foundation types of funds. And then one other and one budget, what budget? Okay, very good, very helpful. I think that's consistent with what we typically see at these focus weeks. So thank you very much for sharing. That helps me kind of know where we're at for the group. Okay, so what is a budget? I really like this simple definition. It's from Dave Ramsey, who's kind of a personal finance guru. And he simply says, a budget is telling your money where to go instead of wondering where it went. And so, with focusing on our activities that are involved with your project that you need to achieve your goals, hopefully through working on these sustainability plans that you'll be telling your money where to go instead of the latter point that Dave is making there about wondering where it all went. And this is an open question for the group, so feel free to respond or put something in the chat. But what comes to mind when you think of budgeting? All right. Strategic investment from Carrie. Summer salary and student support from Tom. Scary, inaccurate. Yep, that's fair. Structure, maximizing impact. I like that. Planning out what you want to happen and the costs associated with it. That's very good. Any good plan goes out the window upon contact with reality. Nice. A path to meeting goals, allocation of resources to activities. Yeah, these are all great answers. I think there is or can be some level of trepidation when it comes to budgeting. Before I got into it a whole lot, I felt like a budget was restrictive, that it's going to keep me from doing what I want to do, or a lot of people think of it as a headache and challenging. But I think there are a lot of great ideas here and a lot of positive things that you all hit on that come from budgeting. And I think what I found that really comes out of it is it really, instead of being restrictive and being a headache, obviously it can be some work up front to figure it all out, but it really gives you a lot more freedom at the end of the day when you've spent some time doing it and spent some focus on it. Okay, so the bottom line there is, you want to budget and do your planning here so that you are, swimming in your piles of money like Scrooge McDuck, and hopefully not Michael Scott in The Office having to declare bankruptcy to everyone in your project or your office or what have you. Okay, so we talked about focusing on the activities here. And so what is an activity-based budget? And it's simply something where you're focusing on the volume and the types of activities that you're working with in your project. And why do we think this is important? And I think you can start to see that laid out in the sustainability framework document that you're all filling out a few minutes ago with looking at your goals and activities. And so it's important because you're aligning the activities you're doing with the goals you have that in turn align with the strategy that you're trying to achieve and execute overall for your project. As I mentioned before, it's really important to know all of the costs of all of the activities that you have. We tend to, I think, focus on what the major ones are a lot of times, but there can be some kind of smaller activities that can start to eat into your budget, or things you might not think about that cost money and cost time and effort, but you don't always take the time to plan that out and really think about how much of your resources that is eating up. It's important because it can help you when you start to look at the activities and what they cost and what the effort involved with those is. It can help you align your resources a little bit better. And so if you really start to think critically about some of those activities, and when you add it all up, it becomes pretty staggering how much some things and activities can cost. And you might realize that you don't want to necessarily spend that much on those efforts. And so you might reallocate resources, or you might, be outsourcing something that it's taken a tremendous amount of your time. And so it helps you think through things like that. And you can see where you might be doing well. And so maybe in an activity that you do a lot of and you've kind of gained some efficiency in, you can start to see that play out when you're doing your budgeting and what it costs to do things, and realize, wow, we're really good at doing that. Maybe we're not so good at doing some of those other things that we don't want to do in-house anymore. We want to try to find other ways to get those done, other resources, people we can partner with to help with some of the areas we might not be as strong at. And Nancy already alluded to this, but a really key takeaway here is trying to flip that grant budgeting philosophy instead of, funding bodies. And so I'm going to have these 3 people on my grant budget. I'm going to have this stuff, but I'm not really fully considering everything that I need to do to meet my goals. Is not really the best way to go about thinking about your project, especially longer term when you want to be sustainable and have this last a long time. Grants tend to focus on a relatively short time period, so 3 to 5 years maybe. And then what are you going to do when that time is up? And how are you going to make this continue after that? And sometimes, the grant might not be fully aligned with your strategy. Grants or proposals typically have certain requirements. And so you might need to do certain things or meet certain requirements that don't completely align with your strategy. And so it's really important to think about the activities that you need to do, costing those out, really thinking critically about how much effort those take, and approach it from that angle instead of just saying, yeah, I think that's 3 or 4 people that I need to put on my budget. Again, we're building off of this sustainability planning framework. And so as you did previously, Nancy was getting you to start to look at your goals. Had a few minutes to do that. And here we're talking about your activities and determining your costs. And that's how we fit into this budgeting presentation. And so I really look at it that budgeting is kind of a cyclical approach, where you're looking at defining these activities that are required to do your project. What do they really cost? Really take everything into account. And then how do you manage those costs once, the project and life starts happening? And so in thinking about what types of activities, you might want to budget, these are just some kind of general categories to help you start that thought process. They're certainly not all inclusive. There are definitely things outside of these, but it's to kind of help get the gears working in the mind, and the things to think about when it comes to budgeting. And so you might be developing some kind of new technology. That might be new features. You might have a technology already or a gateway already, and maybe it's time to refresh that and improve it a little bit. And so those are clearly some activities you could think about budgeting. There's a lot that could go underneath, developing new features. Again, it's just a high level to try to get the juices flowing and thought processes going. A lot of gateways are focused on creating and managing content of some sort. And so maybe you're trying to get out there and generate new articles, publications, data sets, trying to get people to contribute to your gateway. And so that takes effort to make that happen, to really, make it known that this is the place to be for articles, publications, data sets on this discipline that you're focused on. Building a community around this is really important too, because if you have a lot of great content out there, you want people to come and check it out. And so how do you get people to do that? Some activities there, you might, be spending some money on doing some marketing of some sort. You might be investing in how you can partner with other similar organizations that you can work with. And maybe they've got an existing community and you're going to try to bring those two together somehow. You might try to recruit new users. And if you want to gain a following, your customer support should be solid. And so when people come, you want to make sure they have a good experience. And so investing some time and effort into supporting the people that you have so that they have a good experience and can pass the word of mouth to others to come join, I think that's an important thing to invest in. This is a technology-based kind of focus week, so there's obviously going to be some kind of technological costs in some way, and so that might mean some kind of IT maintenance, some kind of security costs and activities that you're involved in, or maybe those things are outsourced or done by others. But I think it's always important to understand, what you're getting. Maybe you have an institutional resource that provides some of these things for you. But I think it's really important to be cognizant of and appreciative of, the things you might be getting for free if you're part of a larger organization or institution. That really helps in communicating with administrators and stakeholders when you understand that and appreciate those types of things that you do get. Research and development, I kind of separate this from development of technology or new technology, in that you develop something and then at some point you're probably going to need to develop something else to keep people coming back, to keep things new and fresh. And so this is really making sure that you're spending some amount of time and effort to focus on what that next cool thing is going to be. I think that tends to not get thought about a lot of times. It tends to be, focusing on the front end, but not necessarily thinking down the road about, effort involved with kind of doing that next generation of features or technology that you want to make available. And then, unfortunately, there's a lot of meetings and administrative work and managing people and a lot of those types of things too that often get overlooked and aren't really things that are costed out, but they can take a lot of time. And so I think those types of things are important to keep in mind as well. And the time that you're spending there, and have an appreciation for what that might be costing you, your project, and your group. So, I know Nancy gave you a little time to get started and you probably worked on some goals, but I thought we would take a few minutes here at this juncture to make a list of some of the activities that you would need to be budgeting for based on, that early list of goals that you started in the first hour of this. So go quiet here for a few minutes and give you a chance to think about what some of those activities be. I'll go back. I'll start here on this slide to give you some ideas, and then in a minute or two, I'll go to the next one to, maybe help you generate those ideas on activities that you'd be budgeting for. And I don't have a place for this to go out there on the shared drive. I don't know that that's needed at this time, but to help you get your ideas started for this area. Okay, like Nancy mentioned, it's hard to know when people are ready to talk without being there to walk around, but hopefully you had a chance to start your list there. Alan commented in the chat, what if we need all these activities? Which, is probably going to be the case on some of your projects, particularly maybe ones that are well developed. So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely a possibility and a reality. So if that's the case, it's probably something that's going to take some time that you'll need to devote to budgeting. And I know that can be challenging to carve out. I wish I had, like a silver bullet or magic solution for carving that time out. But that's a lot to think about when you're looking at, this list and starting to think about what all of these things cost. So, I would say, don't try to do it all in a day. That's probably not realistic. Try to break it out in chunks. And, if there's other people that you're collaborating with that might, be knowledgeable in some of these areas, that, might be something that people can pitch in on and do costing out or budgeting for some of these specific activities, and doesn't fall all on one person's shoulders necessarily. Let's see, Tom said, I'm trying to map them all to the standard budget form and imagine how university grants proposals admin would approve them even before I submit.
Is that clear?
So I think you're talking about when you're submitting a grant proposal, there's a standard template or format you have to follow.
Right. Yeah. I mean, these are all things that I guess I think about as developing a grant. But right, this is, I guess what you're talking about is way beyond the level of a single grant, and not even necessarily an academic sort of exercise putting that grant together. Right. I mean, your audience here is not just the PI on the grant.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, this isn't meant to align, perfectly with a grant proposal. It's really meant to, think about the things and the details and align to your project. And so you're going to have to make that fit, whatever template or format is required, I think, on a proposal. But when I get to talking about the full costs, I kind of get into some categories there. Those are a little more aligned with what a grant proposal looks like in most cases. Okay, did anyone want to share some of their activities? It's always nice to have at least one person share. Would anyone like to talk about what they took away in the activities that they're planning to budget?
Well, I'll just add something. This is Kirsten. I'm from the National Microbiome Data Collaborative.
Hi, Kirsten.
Right now, I think we're in a different phase than maybe some of the other projects where we've got some bulk funding for a pilot and to build out our infrastructure and to kind of iterate a little bit with the user community and make sure that we develop something at a first pass that's super useful. And then we want to position ourselves to seek out other kinds of funding moving forward that might go hand in hand with like reaching out to other groups for different types of data. So right now we're focused on DOE data. In the future, we might look to organizations like NSF to say, hey, maybe your community has data sets you'd like to share with us. And so what we've been talking about in our chat is how operationally we've got way more of an investment right now on engineering, on prototyping, on user-centered design. And we think that that could effectively be dramatically reduced once we're out of this pilot.
Mm-hmm.
And so this activity type framing, I think, is helpful because there's kind of, you can break up different phases of what you're doing and say, okay, for the pilot, the build out, and like all of this kind of scaling work and stuff, like we're going to have more costs because we're figuring out what we're doing. And then there's kind of the moving forward plan, assuming we're successful. And so anyway, I guess all I wanted to add was like maybe thinking about what phase your project is in drives the activities that are required to support it, which then drives the budget that you need to have.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, you're spot on. I think there's definitely a season for some of these things. And so if you're in this pilot phase and you're going to be investing in and have activities that are, probably going to be pretty different than a project that's a few years down the road. And so, I mean, there's really probably a constant evolution to this, and it's not, something that you do once and you're done. It's something that you should really be reevaluating periodically, and periodically the period can be different for different projects, but I would say you want to look at it at least once a year and evaluate kind of what you did the prior year and what you think you're going to do the following year at minimum. And if you can do it more often than that, then that's always a good thing, I think. Okay, thank you for sharing. All right, so next here, did I miss a slide? No. Okay, next year we're going to talk about the full, Mona had a question as well. Let's see here. Once activities are budgeted, would the next step then be mapping to the personnel needed? And how do you determine a percent of a person? Yeah, Mona, that's really the next step. And I have a little activity here, an example that I'll show you here in a few minutes that's directly related to that. Okay, so a good way to figure out your costs and your full costs is first of all, if you've had a project going for a little while, you're going to have some kind of historical costs up to this point in time. And so if you can get access to reports on that or assistance from financial support staff of some sort, they can give you some of that information to look at and evaluate what you've done historically. That really helps you in doing some of that planning going forward. As Mona touched on, you're going to work on estimating percent of staff effort on specific activities. And then something that's important to keep in mind too that can get lost at times is, are there any kind of indirect costs or hidden types of costs that you need to think about? So indirect can have a couple of meanings, with a grant, which many of you in this group have, there's indirect costs oftentimes associated with those that an institution takes a percentage of whatever grant money you're awarded to help fund, supporting that grant on an institutional basis. So, hopefully you have an understanding of what that is, what percentage is being taken out of your grant. But it's also, important to some projects may have to rent office space. Do you have kind of utilities? Is there administrative support you need to help you function, that aren't, directly related to like developing content or developing technology or software and doing those types of things, but are still costs associated to it. Just make sure that those types of things don't get forgotten or overlooked. Again, you want to get all of the costs, direct and indirect. Another hidden cost can be institutional allocations, or what some people call taxes. And so some institutions may expense every department on campus X amount of dollars for, phones or internet connectivity or different things that the university provides. And so, make sure you have an understanding of what those are. If you're looking at historical costs or, current costs, make sure you ask tough questions. If you don't understand why you have this expense, push back and make sure that you have an understanding of what it is. And maybe there's, accidents happen. Sometimes things get charged at the wrong place. There may be other ways for that cost to get covered. by a department or somewhere else in the organization. So if something doesn't make good sense to you, then I would ask the hard questions. Make sure you're establishing expectations for the resources you have. And like I mentioned earlier, when you have this, when you start to do this process and budgeting and figuring out your costs and having a good understanding of those, it really helps you communicate with administrators and stakeholders. And if you have needs, if you're trying to get help from others and you have a good understanding of this, that's really helpful in those conversations. And so, something to take away too here is, if doing this budgeting and making your project successful is important to you, and if it matters more to you than anyone else, then you should take ownership of that. And sometimes you're just not able to depend on, maybe administrative folks at an institution or elsewhere to do this in a way that's really going to make you successful like you want to be. And so sometimes you just have to take ownership of that. Thinking about the costs in some kind of higher level categories. And so to Tom's point about a budget proposal for a grant. And so the three main ones here, the way I think about it is you have labor, you have more operating expenses, and then you have some kind of indirect or hidden types of things. So labor, you have salaries, benefits, make sure you understand how benefits are expensed. If you're at an institution, those are handled differently at different places. And sometimes the way they allocate those expenses can be changed over time. Benefits costs are continuing to increase. And so just making sure you keep that in mind if you're looking at planning, especially over multiple years, that, if that's going up 5% a year or what have you, that's going to add up over time. With labor, you also might have consultants, you might have grad students or undergrads helping you out. And like that benefit escalation, you'd also have annual raises. So if you have people that you're paying, then at times you're going to be giving them annual raises, and that can add up over time as well. For operating types of things, those are things, like IT services, phone or internet connectivity. Not as a lot of travel today with the pandemic, but that's typically a pretty significant cost for a lot of projects. If you are kind of infrastructure focused, you might be buying a lot of hardware or other kinds of capital equipment. There might be maintenance or repairs you need to do on certain things. Subscriptions to journals or organizations or services, marketing costs, which we touched on a little bit. If you are, more of an entrepreneur, or you're kind of do some, things and blazing your own trail, setting out on your own, there might be some legal things you need help with as far as maybe setting up agreements or contracts. And, if you have or need your own space, then rent might be a consideration. Overhead and F&A obviously is the big indirect one. But like I said, there's also at times institutional allocations, planning for future maintenance. You don't always expect things to break or need maintained. But, making sure that if you have a little extra money set aside for that, that's important too. Inflation, again, if you're planning multiple years out, talked about salaries and benefits going up, but costs for services go up as well. And so those don't just stay flat. And then if you are, investing in infrastructure and you need to maintain that over a longer period of time, eventually those things have to be replaced. And so planning for some type of life cycle replacement is helpful too. So to kind of think about it from the standpoint of doing an activity. And so this example, we decide we want to grow community by 25%. So this is just purely thinking about the types of activities that might be involved in doing that. So we want to grow our community by 25%, whatever that means. You're obviously going to have some labor effort involved with that. And so that could mean meeting with prospective partners, recruiting. And so maybe going out to conferences and meetings. And so you have some travel costs and time costs associated with that. Direct calls, emails, providing a good service and experience for your current community so that the word of mouth gets out there. And then you also might want to invest in some marketing. So that can mean sponsorships, advertisements, beefing up your social media presence and hiring someone to do some of that work for you. And so getting you to think about, grow community by 25% has all of these things underneath that would have to happen to have a cost associated with them. Okay, so here's, Mona asked about labor effort estimation. And so this is something that we're going to cover here. And so our example on this one is we need to add 3 new features. So we need 3 new features developed over the next year. And this is just a quick, simple calculation of how you could do that. So we, first row here, we have a new feature development. We want to do 3 of those. We're estimating it takes 500 hours per feature. And so if we have 3 features of 500 hours each, we need 1,500 hours to do that in a year. We're going to assume that that's 188 days based on an 8-hour day. And that when you take total working days per year, so if you take out holidays and weekends and vacations and sick time for folks, a given person has about 220 days that they work per year. And that comes out to about 85% of an FTE is what we would be looking at to develop 3 new features in a year.
So Nate, can I just hop in for a sec?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Is this, are we going to set people up with this as a little back of the envelope thing coming up?
Yep, we are.
Okay, so before you get into that, I just, I love this. So I know I see some stuff in the chat about some of this budgeting looks, a lot of this could be formulaic. Like we're not sharing categories that you haven't seen before. And the way we're talking about it, I hate to admit, may not be the most practical thing for you to look at the way you're doing it today. But if you kind of suspend disbelief for a little bit longer, it's a pretty interesting example to do what Nate's going to set us up with, because it's again deriving from, here's a goal we're going to set for ourselves. And let's be really clear, we're going to have 100 new university teams or labs submitting their computational models to our project. Well, let's sit around the table and figure out what kind of work we need to do to get those 100 new teams to do that submission. And then let's figure out how much time that's really going to take. So do I hire 1 person, 3 people, 10 people to get that done? And so we're just encouraging a thought process that's very much from the bottom up. And at the end of the day, we will forgive you if you actually still go ahead and just hire 3 people and say, try it. But at least still have a hunch as to whether you're likely to get close. What we don't want, I had a friend of mine who said, she has a school, she literally wanted 100 new students. And she said, I'm going to be very ambitious. I'm going to get 100 new students. And I said to her, that's great. How are you going to get them? And she hadn't really fully worked through what that looked like. How much effort to get 1 new student? And so there's nothing wrong with being ambitious, but we want you to feel confident as well as ambitious that the plan has a likelihood of success. So I'll be quiet again, but I think I'm going to love to see what you come up with, both on what activity you choose to price or cost, and how you think about what the components of that cost are going to be.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. So this is an example of 3 new features need to develop. But when you're doing that and you're going to have to do something with those developed new features. And so it's not just the cost of developing them, but there's other costs that are associated with that in getting it out there in production for people to see. So it's not purely just a development effort. And so if you break that down a little bit more, and so if we're thinking about it from a team-wide labor effort type of thing. So we have those develop new features. Here's the top line, which we've already done at 85%. But say you have someone that's managing, giving oversight of those new features. So there's time involved with that. You may need to document those new features so people know how to use them. So there's time associated with that. Those new features, after developed, they have to be deployed somehow. That takes effort. You might want to market those features and tell your community that they're out there and spend some effort doing that. And then, after the fact, you would likely need to provide some kind of support to help people if they're not quite clear on how the features are working. And so they may have questions or need help, or there may be some bugs that need fixed, et cetera. And so add that all together, and you start out at 85%, you're up another third or so of a position to make that happen. And to Kirsten's point here, yeah, there's a number of skills that are needed to make this happen. And it's not necessarily just one person or a couple of developers that would likely do all of this. There's probably some other people on a team that need to devote some effort to this as well. Okay, so we have this workbook out here. It was in the pre-work workshop materials folder that Claire shared this morning. And within that folder, there's one called Session Exercises, where there's this SGCI budgeting workbook. And it looks like the previous slide that we looked at. So this is what it looks like currently. It's out on the Google Drive. I'm encouraging you all for this exercise to go out there. Please either make a copy of this or download it so you're not overriding everyone's changes and activities that they're putting in. And just, think of an activity. And so whether you're developing 100 widgets or whatever the case may be, think about that, about an estimate for the time it takes. And then if there are, other activities that are kind of related to making that happen, make sure you're thinking about what some of those other types of skills, like marketing, deploying, customer support, those kind of things. So I'm going to give about 5 minutes to just play with this a little bit and to get an idea of the type of effort and FTE that you would need.
Hey, could you put up the slide that just shows, you could put in a lot of rows here, but could you show the slide that shows just for one activity what your buildup looked like?
Yeah. That one?
Yeah. I would put that one up. Yeah, just like one activity, just so that that thought process is.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. I mean, start with one if you can do another or what have you. That's great. But yeah, one is perfectly sufficient. Okay, so I'm gonna move ahead here to talk about some cost management strategies, and these are focused around these 3 areas here that you see on the screen. So the first one is around scale. And so, hiring and managing people is an expensive proposition. It's a big investment. And so that's kind of, another reason why we really challenge people to think about the activities and, doing estimations on those to really try to get a good sense of the effort involved and the people that you need, because it's expensive to hire people. It's expensive to fire people. And You know, make sure that you're considering all the costs that are associated with doing those things. And, you know, do you have an exit strategy? You know, if you come to the end of the grant and you have several people that you've hired, and the funding's going away, how are you going to deal with that situation? Thinking about technology, you know, there's lots of things to consider. Are you going to do on-premise versus cloud? Are you going to develop your own software that you need, or are there other softwares out there that you can purchase as a service? And then timing is really important. And so trying to map out your project on a realistic timeline, and what are the right times to be hiring people along the way as things evolve, as things progress. And if you're growing, you know, think about, you know, what those next steps and milestones are going to be along your project timeline. And so a key takeaway here is that, you know, controlling more functions can cost you more. So if you want to have on-premise hardware, if you want to do all of your own development, if you want to hire all of your own people, that may ultimately cost you significantly more than if you can do some outsourcing, find some other ways to cover some of those needs.
Can I jump in for a second on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
Experience on that is that one thing we found the hard way is that outsourcing technical development can be extraordinarily costly without much return, and because the problem is that for a lot of the science gateways we've seen in this group, including ours, we're trying to do something that's very specialized, and it's not the kind of thing that generic web developers know what to do with. And so that means you need to hire someone. If you hire someone temporarily, postdoc or short term, then you have to have some kind of institutional memory to be able to train them. And then you have to invest, actually pay them salary while they're learning what's going on in the project. Mm-hmm. So you end up losing a fair amount of money by either using ineffective outsourcing or repeatedly hiring and firing people. I mean, this makes it's a conundrum. Of course, this means you keep people on for long periods of time, which is a good thing, but that means the cost goes on for a long period of time. You can't be agile and hire temps to do the work on at least in our experience on the Science Gateway, because of the kind of work it is. And so you have to invest in personnel for at least some kind of personnel. Maybe there's some you can come and go, but some kind of personnel, you've got to invest in them and then try to keep them.
Yep. Correct. All great points. Yeah. Wasn't, saying not to ever hire anyone to outsource everything. I mean, that's definitely not the case, because you're right on, and that a lot of these development needs are specialized and specific, but maybe there are some more, maybe it is just web development that you could outsource and have someone else do. And so that you're not trying to ask your specialized development people to do web development when they can be focusing on, what's really the most important thing for your project. Okay. There we go. Host institution resources. So there can be some really good things to look for if you have a host institution here. And so a lot of institutions will have contributions that they can make via office space. They might have enterprise level software licenses, administrative support to help you that are covered by the indirect costs that they are recovering. Something you might want to consider doing is establishing an income producing center. And so at some institutions, you can set up a rate to charge for your services and collect revenue for those services. And so not being solely dependent on those grants from external funders, but being able to generate some of your own income via that income producing center model. Some institutions have internal funding or grants that they can provide. Some places might have key initiatives around the life sciences or engineering et cetera? And can you align your project with those initiatives to tap into some of that funding that might be available from an institutional perspective? As well as they might have some equipment grants, bridge funding opportunities if you're between grants and things of that nature. And then, if you're struggling with having some flexibility as far as doing your sustainability plan, or maybe, you're more of an entrepreneur and setting up kind of a separate entity. Some institutions have a research foundation that have the flexibility to help you with those things and the expertise to do those kind of things too. And so that might be something that you want to consider as well. So if you can't be smart, have smart friends and find those people at your organization or institution that can help you along. And then partnerships touched on briefly earlier, but if there are other, groups or organizations or projects out there that are doing similar things, is there a way that you can come together and avoid some costs? And so maybe there's someone out there that has some of this, specialized development expertise that you could have help you with your project. And there might be a mutually beneficial thing here where you're stronger in other areas that you could help another group with. So it can really potentially help you, speed things up in achieving some of your goals. But it's really important to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are clearly understood, and it's the right fit for your group. So make sure you do your due diligence on getting involved in something like that. But it really can be something that is extremely helpful. And so we're at the 2 o'clock mark. I had just a couple more slides here that we're not going to get to, but the slides will be available out there for everyone to look at. Thanks, everyone. Great questions. Good conversation.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks, guys.